Hey everyone, this is Morgan and
And I'm Caroline Morgan, Miss Morgan.
not related.
Yes, no relation.
We're here to talk about Album of the Week. And for the first week of school every year, I always choose the same two. It's a doubleheader and it's a whopper. It is Rubber Soul and Revolver by the Beatles. And I invited the other Morgan in today because she was in her teens in
Oh yeah,
Britain when these came out and really experienced them firsthand. And you have to understand about music in the early 1960s. If you wanted to record an album, you went into the studio with a producer, and the record label handed you the songs you were going to record. They were written by these, standard authors that they had. Now, some of these were amazing writers. I mean, Carole King, was one of these writers. James Taylor was one of these writers. And then the studio had stock musicians, and this was all they did. And in fact, there's a great documentary, if you can find it, called The Wrecking Crew, that talks about the Southern California musicians who all made their living as the band you actually heard when all of these artists recorded. But that was not going to be the Beatles. After the Beatles got some success, and A Hard Day's Night and Help, their first two films came out, they had some clout. And they went in to the studio to do this one, Rubber Soul. Came out in December of 1965, December 3rd. I looked it up. And they wrote every song on the album. They played every instrument on the album. And they had heard Bob Dylan by this point. They had met Dylan here in the US in 65. And they wanted their music to have meaning. They wanted the lyrics to mean something.
Yeah, that was the issue back then with the standard writers for the labels. A lot of the things sounded very similar. They didn't play their own music, and they were just sort of boppy, poppy songs that didn't really have any particular messages. It was just, and a lot of it sounded exactly the same from one, because they were having the same musicians at least playing in the background. Yeah, and the Beatles were some of the first who said, no, we want our music to be our music and be our way of doing things. So, yeah.
So it hit, and it hit big. Okay, this album is consistently still talked about by critics today as being one of the top 10, if not top 5 albums ever recorded. And the tracks on it, you've heard them many times over. The song Michelle has been recorded so many times. I think my favorite on the album was actually called Norwegian Wood. Okay. It was a great song. But wow, other musicians heard this and said, hey, if the Beatles can do that. And Brian Wilson, the head Beach Boy, he said, no way are we going to just keep doing the same thing. If you bought any of the first 5, 6 Beach Boys albums, you have to understand, every song on them was either about a car, a girl, or surfing. And some of them, all 3.
I was going to say, 2 out of 3 at least, every one.
Glenn Fry of the Eagles thought he really nailed it with the Eagles song Take It Easy, because he had gotten a girl, a car, and God into the same line when he's talking in that one. Go listen to the song, you'll know which line. So what happened was Brian Wilson started to write what became an album we'll feature next week called Pet Sounds. We'll come back to that one. But the Beatles built on this success, and they did Revolver. Now, this is the one that consistently gets called the best album ever recorded. I mean, it even beat Sgt. Pepper in most people's accounts, especially musicians, okay? And it introduced one psychedelia, because with the song Tomorrow Never Knows and with the song Yellow Submarine, all of a sudden, especially Tomorrow Never Knows, the last track on the album, it was a protest album against the British government. The opening track was George Harrison's song Taxman.
Right.
It was like a 95% tax rate.
Oh yeah. To the people were moving. Anybody who was earning any money was moving out of Britain and going to the Channel Islands, to Jersey, which was actually still Britain, but a whole different tax situation.
So is that
Caribbean? What?
Is that how you ended up in Hong Kong?
No, not exactly. I don't think so. And if my dad was earning so much money that he went to Hong Kong for that, I've never seen any of it. So no. He was a civil servant. He was actually working for the government at the time and took a government job out there.
So tell me a little bit about what it was like to be a young teenager and to have these albums around.
Well, first of all, people here, I don't think, realize when I was 65, I was a young teenager is a good description. And we were going to school, but everything was very regimented in school. I know everybody, your kids here will think that, there's rules and everything about school all the time, but it was even more difficult in Britain. We all had uniforms. We all had to look exactly the same. Down to what color socks and shoes and what type of shoes you wore and everything.
Just watch
what? Yes.
Your...
Well, yeah, exactly. And it was really, I can remember you really didn't do a huge amount of thinking for yourself back then because everything was just organized. You went to school, you wore a uniform, you didn't have to choose anything, you didn't, and your parents were always made all the decisions. I was really lucky. My family actually did give us some say in what went on with family activities and things like that. But most kids didn't. We didn't go out that much. There was no going out and there wasn't much anyway, hanging out with people. Hanging out with your friends, not in my experience anyway. It was very just day after day, the same thing. And the music was sort of similar to that. And when people started making protest songs about the government, it was a huge, huge, big deal. And I can remember 65, older teenagers than me starting, years ahead of me at school, starting to rebel in school, because school was the big thing of the day. We didn't do anything else during the daytime except go to school, come home, do homework. So what happened in school was the start of noticing that stuff was going on. Like all the older girls would start hiking up their skirts because 64, 65 was mini skirts.
Oh, how
our school uniform skirts had to be, I can even remember it, 2 inches above the ground when you were kneeling. And yes, they did make you kneel on a chair and with a ruler measure the height of your skirt to make sure it was 2 inches from the chair to your skirt line.
My mom used to tell stories about growing up in Pittsburgh, and in the mid-1940s, you had to kneel and the skirt had to touch the ground.
Well, ours had to be 2 inches, so it was that much, so give or take, And I remember, we would get lined up, and and boys' hair couldn't touch their collar, and stuff like that. And so you can imagine, the Beatles with that bob haircut that they all had, which was, oh my gosh, that's so sort of out there. And I can remember older students in my school suddenly going against the hierarchy and going against the establishment by rolling up the waistband of their skirts so that they were wearing a mini skirt in school and letting their hair grow down so shock horror it was down on their shoulders for the boys, this sort of thing. Oh, and if they had grown it long enough that they would have to have pulled it back into some sort of ponytail or man bun or whatever they call it now, the sky would have fallen on them.
So,
I can remember. Yeah.
Let me ask you really about something that is just jumping out at me about this era and what an album like this, how it would have been received. Because in America, you could hear anything on the radio, and stations might play a very wide variety of music,
Oh,
and there would be a rock and roll show, or
right.
there might be, a rock and roll station even to play stuff. But I know that back in that era, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation,
Right.
had complete control,
Right.
dictatorial,
Absolutely.
draconian rules about what could be played on the radio. And
Absolutely.
there existed this amazing thing
Called
called
pirate radio.
pirate radio.
Oh, and of course, I am a huge fan of a particular pirate radio, which because it was called Radio Caroline, and that was like my radio station. Yes. So as I guess in '65, thinking about how old I was, I might not have been quite so aware of it then, but a couple of years later, oh yeah, pirate radio. The BBC was the broadcasting station, television and radio, and they basically had a monopoly for quite a long time. You had to pay a fee if you had a television. You had to pay a fee to the BBC, whether you watched their shows or not. There were some independent television station which was commercial and was funded by advertisements. But the BBC was funded by what they called the license fee, and everybody who owned a television had to pay a license fee to the BBC, whether they actually watched the BBC channels or not. And that funded the television and the radio stations. And I'm trying to remember how many there were back there. There's more now, but there was BBC One, which was the pop station, the music station. There was Radio 2, whether that was around back then, was a sort of more sort of middle of the road music station, and Radio 3 was classical. And then they had a news station as well. I guess that was 4. But that was it. But if you wanted to listen to anything that wasn't sanctioned by the British Broadcasting Corporation, you went outside the system to the pirate radios. And most of the pirate radios they had to be not on land, because if they were on the land in Britain, then they would be subject to the rules of the BBC, basically. So they were all on ships, and they were outside British waters, about 3 miles offshore, on ships that were broadcasting from out to sea. Oh, well, out in the Channel or in the North Sea. Actually, Radio Caroline was in the North Sea.
Yeah.
And so we used to listen to that, and it was always getting knocked off the radio. About every month or so, Radio Caroline would disappear for a little while, because either storms in the North Sea had disrupted the broadcasting, or the Coast Guard had come out and was harassing them, or the boat had drifted into British waters and the Coast Guard had come and had towed them in and everything. So there was a movie years ago. I'm trying to think how many years ago.
Oh, it's been at least a decade, but in this country, it was called pirate radio.
That's right. And it was literally the story of Radio Caroline. They didn't call it, on the movie, they didn't call it Radio Caroline, but it was very much the story of how those radio stations worked. And we all used to
the film was Bill Nighy,
Mm-hmm.
who played Rufus Scrimgeour in the Harry Potter film. So the students
Right.
would know him from that.
That's right. And that was a very good, actually quite an accurate description of what, that it was like at the time, that they were harassed totally by the authorities about broadcasting.
So if you wanted to hear the song Taxman, you weren't going to hear that on the BBC.
No, the BBC would not have approved that, because that was anti-Thatcher and no, she wasn't around then, but anti-government. But you would have had to listen to that on Radio Caroline, or one of there was a few others, but Radio Caroline was actually the more famous of them. Mainly, probably because it was broadcasting a lot towards London, and that was where the people were. But anyway.
So these were two really just amazing albums, influential, other musicians. I know that one of my personal favorite bands, Genesis, the singer is Phil Collins, and he re-recorded several songs that they have done, including his own version of Tomorrow Never Knows, which is from Revolver. And you probably heard a dozen different artists recording songs from Rubber Soul over the years. Okay, so I think what I would say to the students is, these are two albums you really need to listen to understand the concept of album rock.
Mm-hmm.
listen to it from the start to the finish. Don't play one song.
Right.
The point was that the whole album was going to be good, and not just that you'd have a hit single and 9 other songs that forced you to buy the record.
Right. And often this was the start of albums, the whole album telling a story. It was the start that they were beginning to get it. They hadn't quite made it like the whole album quite yet. That's coming.
Yeah.
But it was the start of there being more, as Mr. Morgan said, more than just one song that was all you heard, and the rest was just apt to fill in the space on the record. There was the beginning of an actual plan and a flow through the whole eight or nine, however many tracks that would be on the record.
Another good thing to point out is that when the Beatles recorded their very first record, they were in the studio for 12 hours for one day, and that was it. The album was done.
Mm.
And that was typically what an artist would do, go in and do everything in one day.
Right.
And then the studio musicians would finish out the rest. And then at this point, the Beatles started to say, no, we're going to work here in the studio. We're going to develop the sound. We're going to record it 20 times until we like what it sounds like.
Yeah.
And then, that really would reach a crescendo with something like Pink Floyd moving into the studio to do Dark Side of the Moon,
right.
Or Led Zeppelin moving into that castle, Headley Grange.
And starting to lead into the whole, when the technology caught up, of overdubbing things and doing things multiple tracking and stuff like that, which we also talk about a bit later in this series.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks for joining us for this today.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad to be here, and hi to everybody who's listening. And if you remember me, I'm doing fine, and I will be around. So.
All right. So we'll sign off with the kids now. Everybody have yourselves a safe day.
Take care. Bye.